My dad tried to force me to cut my hair, so my aunt decided to get revenge. I just turned 18 and saved $3,000 for my first car. My parents had promised to match whatever I saved, just like they did for my siblings. But at my birthday dinner, my dad dropped a bomb. I wouldn't get a penny until I cut my shoulder-length hair. Get rid of your girl hair, he said. If you're old enough to drive, you're old enough to look like a real man. I'd grown it for 2 years. Girls loved it. I took care of it. But my ultra-conservative father apparently saw it as some threat to masculinity. My mom was furious. My siblings backed me up, but Dad wouldn't budge. Someone needs to teach him not to be a sissy. A few days later, my Aunt Rachel called, Dad's sister, but nothing like him. She's a successful lawyer who moved to Seattle and only visits for holidays. Heard about your hair situation, she said. Yeah, it sucks. Your father's being an ass. But listen, I have a proposition. Can you keep a secret? Sure? I mean it. Not even your mom can know yet. Okay, I promise. I'll buy you a car. Full price. No strings attached. My heart stopped. Aunt Rachel, I can't. Yes, you can. But there's something you need to know first. About why your father is really doing this. What do you mean? She sighed. Your dad had long hair once, in college. Longer than yours. No way. Check his senior yearbook. Hidden in the garage, top shelf, blue box. He looked exactly like you do now. Same hair, same face. It's uncanny. So why? Because of what happened when his father, your grandfather, saw it. He did something similar but worse. Told your dad he was cut off completely unless he shaved his head. Not just cut it, shaved. Your dad refused for months. Lived in his car, nearly dropped out. Finally caved when winter hit. I felt sick. He's doing to me what Grandpa did to him? Cycles, kiddo. But here's the thing. I know something about your dad. He doesn't want anyone to know. Something that happened that same year. What? Not over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow? Starbucks on 5th, 2 p.m.? I agreed. The next day, I told Mom I was going to work and met Rachel. She looked serious, sliding a manila folder across the table. Before you open this, understand that I'm showing you this for leverage, not destruction. Your father needs a wake-up call, not a demolished life. I opened it. Inside were photos from what looked like the 1990s. My dad, with his long hair, at what was clearly a protest, holding signs, getting arrested. Dad was arrested? For protesting against military recruitment on campus. He was a full-blown hippie activist before Grandpa broke him. Spent a night in jail. Got it expunged from his record later, but I kept the documentation. Why would this matter? Your dad's job requires security clearance. He never disclosed this arrest. If it came out now, he'd lose everything. Exactly. But we're not going to let it come out. We're going to make him think it might. Rachel laid out the plan. She'd already bought me a car, a used Honda Civic. Nothing fancy, but reliable. It was parked at her hotel. Tomorrow, she'd come to dinner and present Dad with a choice. The next evening, Rachel arrived unannounced. Dad was shocked. Rachel, what are you doing here? Came to see my nephew's new car. She tossed me the keys. Dad's face went red. You had no right. Sit down, Michael. Her lawyer voice. Dad actually sat. She pulled out a photo, him with long hair at the protest. His face went white. Remember this? Remember telling me you'd rather die than be like Dad? Yet here you are, doing exactly what he did to you. That's different. Is it? You're withholding money he earned because of his appearance. Sound familiar? Mom grabbed the photo. Is this you? You told me you were always clean cut. Here's what's happening, Rachel continued. You're going to apologize to your son, match his savings like you promised, and never, ever pull this controlling bullshit again. Or what? Or I share this with whoever needs to see it. Your choice. Dad stood up, shaking with rage. You're blackmailing me? I'm protecting my nephew from becoming you, broken by his father, perpetuating the cycle. Dad turned to me. You knew about this? Before I could answer, Mom spoke. Michael, what arrest? What is she talking about? Dad's phone rang. He looked at it and went pale. It's my supervisor. At 7 p.m.? Rachel smiled. Oh, did I mention I had lunch with General Ronan yesterday? Your boss? Interesting conversation about background checks coming up for contract renewals. Dad answered the phone with shaking hands. Yes, sir? We could hear shouting through the phone. Words like investigation and undisclosed incidents. Dad hung up, staring at Rachel. What did you do? Nothing yet. That's about something else entirely. But curious timing, isn't it? That's when Mom stood up, holding something I hadn't noticed. Dad's old journal from college, the one he thought he'd burned. Michael, she said quietly, what's Project Exodus? Dad's face went from white to green. Dad's face stayed green while he stared at that journal like it might explode. Mom held it up higher, her hand steady, even though I could see her fingers trembling a little. The room felt like someone had sucked all the air out. Rachel leaned back in her chair with this satisfied look, but something felt wrong about the whole scene, like watching pieces on a chessboard that were all wrong colors. Dad opened his mouth twice before any sound came out. His phone buzzed again on the table where he'd dropped it. The screen lit up with another call from his supervisor. He didn't pick it up this time, just stared at that journal in Mom's hands like she was holding his entire life. His phone kept buzzing, kept lighting up, and finally went quiet. 30 seconds later, it started again. Mom set the journal down on the dining table, right next to Rachel's folder of protest photos. She walked over and picked up Dad's phone, looked at the screen, then handed it to him without saying anything. Dad's hands shook so bad when he took it that he fumbled and dropped it. The phone bounced off the edge of the table and hit the floor. He bent down to grab it, and I swear it took him 3 tries to actually get his fingers around it because his hands wouldn't stop shaking. When he stood back up, his face had gone from green to this weird gray color. He answered the call, and his voice came out all rough. The shouting through the phone was loud enough that we could all hear it clearly. His supervisor wasn't even trying to keep his voice down. Words like investigation and undisclosed incidents and serious breach kept cutting through. Dad just stood there taking it, his free hand gripping the back of a chair so hard his knuckles went white. He tried to say something a couple times, but his supervisor just talked right over him. Finally, Dad managed to get out that he'd come to the office right now, tonight, whatever was needed. The supervisor said something else we couldn't quite hear and hung up. Dad lowered the phone and stared at it for a second. Then he bent down, picked it up again, even though he was already holding it, and I realized he'd dropped it a second time without any of us noticing. This time, when he straightened up, he looked at Rachel with this expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, something worse. Like he was looking at a stranger who'd just burned his house down. Rachel met his eyes and didn't look away. She had this small smile, not quite satisfied but getting there. Mom made this sound, not quite a gasp, but close. Dad turned to look at her and she was staring at Rachel now instead of at him. Mom's voice came out quiet, but with this edge that made my stomach drop. She asked Rachel how long she'd been planning this. Rachel's smile got a little bigger, and she started to say something about protecting family, but Mom cut her off. The quiet edge in Mom's voice turned sharp. She asked again, slower this time, exactly how long Rachel had been planning this ambush. Rachel sat up straighter in her chair. She said she'd been waiting for the right moment ever since she found out about Dad's hypocrisy with my hair. Mom laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind of sound that made you want to back away. She asked Rachel if she really thought this was about protecting me, or if it was about finally getting revenge on her brother. The smile disappeared from Rachel's face. She said that wasn't fair, that she was trying to help, that someone needed to stand up to Dad's controlling behavior. Mom picked up the journal again and asked Rachel if she knew what was in it. Rachel said of course she did. She'd known about Project Exodus for years. Mom shook her head and said Rachel didn't know anything. She opened the journal to a page she'd marked with a torn envelope. She started reading out loud, something about Dad's plans to help students resist recruitment, but then she flipped forward several pages and kept reading. This part was different. It was about Grandpa showing up at Dad's dorm with clippers and 2 of his military buddies, about them holding Dad down, about campus security pulling them apart, about Grandpa getting arrested too, not just Dad, but Grandpa's lawyer making both arrests disappear. Rachel's face changed. She said she didn't know that part. Mom asked her what else she didn't know. Rachel didn't answer. Dad had been standing there watching this whole thing, and now he grabbed his keys off the counter. He said he had to go to his supervisor's office right now, or he'd lose his job tonight instead of maybe keeping it. Mom told him to go. She didn't look at him when she said it. Dad walked toward the front door and stopped with his hand on the knob. He turned back and looked at Rachel. He asked her if she was happy now. Rachel opened her mouth, but Dad was already walking out. The door closed behind him with this soft click that somehow sounded louder than if he'd slammed it. The sound of Dad's car starting up came through the window. We all listened to it back out of the driveway and drive away. Nobody moved until we couldn't hear the engine anymore. Then Mom turned to Rachel and told her to explain herself. Rachel said she was protecting me from becoming another victim of Dad's control issues. Mom asked if that was why Rachel had contacted Dad's supervisor, why she'd arranged for the background check timing, why she'd brought that journal to dinner instead of having a private conversation. Rachel's face got red. She said sometimes you had to force people to face their past. Mom asked who made Rachel the judge of that. Rachel stood up from her chair. She said she wasn't going to apologize for trying to help her nephew escape the same cycle that destroyed her brother. Mom stepped closer to Rachel. She was shorter than Rachel, but somehow seemed bigger right then. She told Rachel that weaponizing family trauma wasn't help. It was abuse dressed up in good intentions. Rachel said that was ridiculous. Mom asked her if she'd thought about what this would do to me, watching my family explode, watching my dad's career get destroyed, watching adults play games with my future. Rachel looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since Dad left. She said she'd gotten me a car, given me freedom, shown me the truth about my father. Mom's voice went even quieter. She asked Rachel if she'd asked me what I wanted. The question just hung there. Rachel looked at me like she expected me to back her up, to say of course I wanted the car and the truth and freedom from Dad's control. But I was sitting there with those Honda keys in my hand, and they felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with actual weight. I'd thought the car was this amazing gift, this escape route, this proof that someone understood what I was going through. Now it felt like a weapon Rachel had handed me to use against my dad. Or maybe a weapon she was using, and I was just holding it for her. I didn't say anything. Rachel's face changed again, something uncertain creeping in. She told Mom she'd done the right thing, that someone needed to break the cycle. Mom said breaking cycles didn't mean burning everything down. She told Rachel to leave. Rachel grabbed her purse off the chair. She said she wasn't going to stand here and be attacked for trying to help. Mom told her that she wasn't being attacked. She was asked to leave until Mom decided if she wanted Rachel in our lives at all. Rachel's mouth opened. She looked at me again and started to say something about the car, about Seattle, about how I could still come stay with her. Mom stepped between us. She told Rachel not to contact me, not to contact any of us, until Mom said otherwise. Rachel's face went from red to pale. She said Mom couldn't keep her from her nephew. Mom said she absolutely could if Rachel was going to keep manipulating him. Rachel looked at me one more time, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Doubt. Real doubt. Like maybe she was starting to wonder if Mom was right. She turned and walked to the front door. She stopped with her hand on the knob, same as Dad had. She said she'd done the right thing, but her voice didn't sound as sure anymore. Then she left. Mom stood there staring at the closed door for a long minute. I heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see my older brother coming down, followed by my two younger siblings. They must have been hiding up there the whole time, listening to everything. My brother looked at Mom and asked if it was safe to come down now. Mom made this sound that was half laugh and half something else. She said it was safe, that the adults were done yelling for tonight. My siblings came into the dining room and we all kind of stood there looking at each other. My sister asked what was going to happen now. Mom said she didn't know. We sat down around the table, all of us, and nobody really knew what to say. My brother finally spoke up. He said Dad had done the same thing to him 5 years ago. We all turned to look at him. He said Dad had told him he wouldn't help with his car unless he cut his hair short. My brother had been growing it out for a year, not as long as mine, but long enough that Dad hated it. He said he'd just cut it because fighting seemed harder than giving in. He looked at me and said he was sorry he hadn't warned me, hadn't stood up to Dad back then, hadn't done anything except take the easy way out. I sat there with those car keys still in my hand. The Honda was parked at Rachel's hotel, waiting for me to come get it. A car I hadn't earned, hadn't chosen, hadn't even asked for. Rachel had bought it before she'd talked to me about any of this. She'd made the decision and then presented it like a gift, like freedom, like salvation. But she'd never asked what I actually wanted. Neither had Dad, really. He'd made his demand about my hair without asking why I'd grown it, or what it meant to me, or if I had any plans to cut it eventually anyway. Both of them had just decided what I should do, and then tried to force me into it. Dad with his control and ultimatums. Rachel with her manipulation and revenge disguised as rescue. I looked at my siblings sitting around the table. My brother who'd given in 5 years ago. My sister who was watching everything with this worried expression. My youngest brother who just looked confused by the whole thing. Mom stood up and walked over to the counter where she'd left the journal. She picked it up and brought it back to the table. She set it down in front of me and told me to read it. I opened it to the first page. Dad's handwriting, younger and messier than it was now, filled the pages. The first entry was dated from his sophomore year of college. He wrote about a military recruiter who'd come to campus and set up a table in the student union, about how angry it made him that they were targeting students who were broke and desperate, about how he'd started talking to other students who felt the same way. The entries went on, getting more detailed, more passionate. He wrote about organizing his first protest, about making signs, about standing outside the recruitment office with 20 other students chanting about military imperialism and economic exploitation. He sounded so different in these pages, so sure of what he believed, so ready to fight for it. I kept reading while my siblings looked over my shoulder. Dad wrote about meeting with other activist groups on campus, about planning bigger protests, about something he called Project Exodus, which was apparently his idea. The plan was to create an underground network to help students resist military recruitment. They'd provide information about alternatives, connect students with counselors who could help them avoid the draft if it ever came back, offer support for anyone being pressured by recruiters. It was bigger than just protests. It was a whole system. Mom sat down next to me and pointed to an entry about 3 months after the first one. This one was different. Dad's handwriting was shakier, more frantic. He wrote about Grandpa finding out about the protests, about Grandpa showing up at his dorm, about the fight that followed. I read about Grandpa bringing 2 of his military friends with him, about them cornering Dad in his dorm room, about Grandpa pulling out clippers and telling Dad he was going to fix this disgrace right now. Dad wrote about fighting back, about campus security getting called, about all three of them getting arrested, about Grandpa's lawyer showing up within an hour, about charges disappearing for everyone involved, about Grandpa threatening to have Dad committed if he didn't drop out of school and come home. I looked up at Mom. She was watching me read with this sad expression. She told me she'd found the journal 3 weeks ago while looking for old tax documents in the garage. She'd been searching for papers for their accountant and found a box Dad had hidden behind old paint cans. Inside was the journal, some photos and letters from people Dad had worked with on Project Exodus. She said she'd been investigating Dad's past ever since, calling old friends of his that she'd met over the years, tracking down people from his college, trying to understand why he'd changed so completely. She'd discovered things even Rachel didn't know about, things about what happened after Grandpa's threats. I asked her what she'd found out. She flipped forward in the journal to entries from later that year. Dad wrote about giving in, about shaving his head, about going home to Grandpa, about Grandpa making him join ROTC as punishment, about spending the next 2 years being broken down and rebuilt into someone Grandpa approved of. The entries got shorter and shorter. The passion disappeared. By the end of the journal, Dad was barely writing at all. Just brief notes about classes and duties and following orders. The last entry was dated the day before he graduated college. All it said was that he was done fighting, that Grandpa had won, that he'd spend the rest of his life being the son Grandpa wanted because being himself had cost too much. Mom closed the journal. She told me Dad had never talked about any of this with her. When they'd met a few years after college, Dad was already working for a defense contractor, already had short hair and conservative views, already seemed like someone who'd always been that way. She said she'd asked him once about college, and he'd just said it was a time he'd rather forget. She'd thought he meant parties or bad grades or something normal. She'd never imagined this. My sister asked why Dad would do the same thing to me that Grandpa did to him. Mom said she'd been asking herself that same question for 3 weeks. She thought maybe Dad saw my long hair every day, and it reminded him of who he used to be. Maybe it scared him to see me making choices he'd once made, knowing how badly the world had punished him for those choices. Maybe he thought if he could control me, force me to conform, he could protect me from the same pain. But all he was doing was becoming Grandpa, repeating the cycle, hurting me the same way he'd been hurt. My brother asked what we were supposed to do now. Mom said she didn't know. Dad's job was in serious trouble. His security clearance was under investigation. Their marriage was a mess. Our family was falling apart. And Rachel, who'd seemed like she was trying to help, had just been using all of us to settle her own score with Dad. Mom looked at me and asked what I wanted. Actually asked me, maybe for the first time in all of this. I looked down at the Honda keys in my hand, then at the journal full of Dad's destroyed dreams, then at my siblings watching me like I had some kind of answer. I told Mom I didn't know what I wanted anymore. The car had seemed like freedom, but now it felt like chains. The truth about Dad had seemed important, but now it just felt sad. Everything felt complicated in a way I hadn't expected. Mom nodded like she understood. She said that was okay, that I didn't have to know right now. She said we'd figure it out together, all of us, without anyone manipulating us or controlling us or deciding what was best for us without asking. My youngest brother asked if Dad was coming back. Mom said yes, eventually, but she didn't know what would happen when he did. We sat there in silence after Mom asked about the other brother. Dad looked at the journal in her hands like it might explode. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Mom set the journal on the table between them and waited. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to make my ears hurt. My siblings shifted in their seats, but nobody spoke. Rachel stood near the door with her arms crossed, watching Dad fall apart. He didn't come home until after midnight. I was still awake, sitting in the living room with Mom and my siblings. We'd been there for hours, not really talking, just waiting. When his car pulled into the driveway, the headlights swept across the wall, and Mom sat up straighter. Dad came through the door looking like he'd aged 10 years in 5 hours. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes were red. He saw us all sitting there and stopped in the doorway. Mom stood up. Dad walked to the couch and sat down hard, like his legs just gave out. He put his face in his hands for a minute, then looked up at us. His security clearance was under formal review. His supervisor had called him in and spent 3 hours going through his background. The undisclosed arrest came up. Questions about why he never mentioned it on any of his applications over the past 15 years. Questions about what else he might be hiding. They were starting a full investigation. It could take months. He might lose his job. He might lose everything. My brother asked what happens next. Dad said they put him on administrative leave starting tomorrow. He can't work on any classified projects until the investigation is done. Can't even go into certain parts of the building. They took his security badge right there in the office. Made him clean out his desk while someone watched. He'd worked there for 12 years, and they treated him like a criminal. Mom asked if he wanted to tell us the rest now. Dad nodded. He started talking and didn't stop for almost an hour. After Grandpa forced him to shave his head, Dad refused. He packed up his dorm room and moved into his car. It was November. Cold, but not freezing yet. He thought he could make it work. He had a part-time job at a bookstore. He showered at the campus gym. He studied in the library until it closed. For the first few weeks, it felt like freedom. Like he was finally standing up to Grandpa's control. Then winter hit. Real winter. The kind that drops below 0 at night. His car didn't have great heat. He piled on every blanket he owned and slept in layers of clothes. He woke up shivering so hard his teeth hurt. One night in December, he couldn't feel his fingers when he woke up. They were white and numb. He drove himself to the emergency room scared he had frostbite. The doctor told him he was lucky. Another hour, and he might have lost fingers. The doctor asked where he lived, and Dad lied, said his heat was broken. The doctor didn't believe him, but let it go. Dad went back to his car that night and cried. He was 19 years old, living in a freezing car, barely passing his classes because he was too cold and tired to study. He called Grandpa the next morning. Grandpa said he could come home any time, as long as he shaved his head first. Dad said no. Grandpa hung up. Dad spent another month in that car. He nearly froze to death twice more. His grades tanked. He lost his job at the bookstore because he kept showing up late and exhausted. He was eating one meal a day, whatever he could afford from vending machines. January was the worst. There was a storm that knocked out power across campus. The library closed. The gym closed. Dad had nowhere to go that was warm. He drove around burning gas he couldn't afford, trying to stay warm. He pulled into a parking lot and tried to sleep, but woke up shaking so badly he thought he was dying. He called Grandpa again. Grandpa said the same thing. Shave your head, come home. Dad said no again, but his voice broke. Grandpa could hear it. Grandpa said he'd give him one more week to come to his senses, then he was done helping. Dad lasted 3 more days. He woke up in his car and couldn't stop shaking. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror and saw someone he didn't recognize anymore. Skinny, exhausted, broken. He drove to Grandpa's house. Grandpa met him at the door with electric clippers. Dad sat in a chair in the garage and Grandpa shaved his head right there. Didn't say a word while he did it. Just removed every bit of hair until Dad's scalp showed through. When it was done, Grandpa told him he could sleep in the guest room, and they'd talk about college in the morning. Dad said giving in that day killed something inside him. He went back to the school the next semester with short hair and followed every rule Grandpa set, declared the major Grandpa wanted, joined the groups Grandpa approved of, stopped seeing friends who reminded him of who he used to be. The arrest got expunged because Grandpa paid a lawyer to make it disappear. Dad graduated, got the job Grandpa arranged, and spent the next 2 years being the son Grandpa wanted. He thought if he just became that person completely, the shame would go away. But it never did. Mom asked about the arrest. Dad's hands shook when he answered. He'd hidden it because he was ashamed. Ashamed that he got arrested for something he believed in, then erased it like it never happened. Ashamed that he let Grandpa break him so completely that he removed the only proof he'd ever stood up for anything. When he applied for security clearance, he knew he should disclose it. But he told himself it was expunged, so it didn't count. He told himself he was protecting his career. Really, he was trying to erase the person he used to be. Every application he filled out, every background check he passed, it felt like he was killing his younger self a little more. The shame just grew bigger every year. I looked at Dad sitting there with his face in his hands and asked him the question I'd been holding since Rachel showed up. Why are you doing the same thing to me that Grandpa did to you? Dad looked up at me and his face crumpled. He started crying, really crying. Not just tears, but these horrible choking sobs. Mom moved closer to him, but didn't touch him yet. Dad said he looks at my long hair every day and sees himself at 19. Sees the kid who believed he could stand up to authority and make his own choices. And it scares him so badly he can barely breathe. Because he knows what the world did to that kid. He knows how much it hurt to be broken. He knows what it feels like to give up everything you believe in just to survive. And he can't stand the thought of me going through that same pain. So he tried to control me first. Tried to make me conform before the world could break me. But all he did was become Grandpa. All he did was hurt me the same way he got hurt. My sister and brothers and I spent the next day in my older brother's apartment, away from our parents. We needed to talk without them there. My sister said Dad's trauma doesn't excuse what he did to me. Understanding why he acted that way doesn't make it okay that he tried to control me. My older brother agreed, but said at least now we know Dad wasn't just being cruel for no reason. He was scared and broken and didn't know how to be anything else. My younger brother asked if we're supposed to forgive him now that we know the whole story. Nobody had an answer for that. My phone rang around noon. Rachel. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 5 minutes later. Again 5 minutes after that. Finally, I answered. She didn't even say hello, just launched into this speech about how I needed to get away from my parents, both of them. Mom was just as bad as Dad for staying with him all these years. They were toxic, and I deserved better. She had a car waiting for me, a place to stay in Seattle, a fresh start where nobody could control me. I just needed to say yes. I told her I needed time to think. Rachel kept pushing. She'd already looked into community colleges near her place. She had connections who could get me a job. She'd help me apply for financial aid. She had my whole life planned out, and I hadn't even agreed to move. The more she talked, the more uncomfortable I got. She wasn't asking what I wanted. She was telling me what she'd decided was best for me. Just like Dad did. Just like Grandpa did. Different reasons. Same control. Mom found out about the call because my sister told her. Mom called Rachel, and I could hear her yelling through the phone from across the room. She told Rachel to back off, or there would be legal consequences. Rachel argued that I'm 18. I can make my own choices. Mom said that's exactly right. I can make my own choices, which means Rachel doesn't get to manipulate me into doing what she wants either. Rachel said she was trying to rescue me. Mom said I don't need rescuing. I need space to figure things out without adults using me to fight their own battles. Dad's investigation got worse. They didn't just find the one arrest. They found records of other protests he'd been part of. They found his name on a list of people who'd been in contact with someone on a federal watch list back in the 90s. That person wasn't dangerous, just another student activist, but the connection was there in the files. Dad had left all of it off every security clearance application he'd ever filled out. His supervisor called him and said the situation was more serious than they'd thought. His job was at serious risk now. They might not be able to keep him even in a non-classified position. Dad spent the next morning in his home office with the door closed. Mom kept walking past, stopping to listen, then walking away again. Around 11, the house phone rang. Dad answered on the first ring. We heard his voice through the door, quiet at first, then surprised. Mom looked at me and mouthed something I couldn't make out. Dad opened the door a few minutes later, holding a piece of paper with a phone number written on it. He said Mitchell Appleby called, his old roommate from college. The background check people contacted Mitchell as a reference. Mitchell wanted to meet Dad before giving his official statement to the investigators. They agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown in 2 hours. Dad went upstairs to change clothes. He came back down wearing jeans and a button-up shirt instead of his usual polo and khakis. Mom asked if he wanted her to come with him. Dad shook his head and said this was something he needed to do alone. He grabbed his keys and left without saying anything else. The rest of us sat in the living room, not really doing anything. My sister scrolled through her phone. My brothers played video games with the sound off. Mom kept getting up to look out the window even though Dad's car was obviously gone. 3 hours passed before we heard the garage door open. Dad walked in looking like someone punched him in the stomach. He sat down on the couch and stared at the coffee table for a solid minute before anyone said anything. Mom finally asked how it went. Dad said Mitchell barely recognized him at first. Mitchell walked right past him in the coffee shop because Dad looked so different from the person he used to be. When they finally sat down, Mitchell spent the first 10 minutes just staring at Dad's short hair and his neat clothes and his clean-shaven face. Mitchell still had long hair, down past his shoulders, gray now, but still long. He wore tie-dye and sandals even though it was cold outside. He looked exactly like the photos from the protest, just older. Dad said Mitchell asked what happened to him, like he was talking to a ghost or someone who died and came back wrong. Mitchell told Dad that everyone from their old protest group thought he disappeared or died. 1 month, Dad was their most active member, organizing events and leading marches. The next month, he was just gone. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing. Someone saw him about a year later walking across campus with short hair and a suit, and they didn't even believe it was the same person until they got close enough to see his face. Mitchell said they all assumed Grandpa finally broke him, but none of them knew how bad it got. Dad told Mitchell about living in his car that winter, about nearly freezing, about Grandpa showing up with clippers and trying to shave his head in public. Mitchell got quiet after that. He said he wished Dad had reached out, that the group would have helped him, given him a place to stay, anything. Dad said he was too ashamed to ask. He felt like asking for help proved Grandpa was right about him being weak. So he just disappeared and tried to become someone Grandpa would approve of instead. Mitchell asked if it worked, if becoming that person made Dad happy. Dad didn't answer that question. The background check got worse 2 days later. Dad's supervisor called and said they found records going back 15 years. Dad's very first security clearance application, the one he filled out when he got hired, also failed to disclose his activism and arrest. This wasn't just one mistake or one oversight. Dad had been lying on official government documents for his entire career. Every renewal, every update, every form, he left out the same information. The supervisor said this level of repeated falsification was grounds for immediate termination. They were keeping him on only because his work record was otherwise spotless, but his clearance was definitely getting revoked. Dad might be able to keep a job in a different department without classified access, but that would mean a major pay cut and basically starting over. I spent that afternoon on my laptop looking up Rachel online. I found her law firm's website first. Big office in Seattle, lots of fancy credentials, awards for family law work. Then I found news articles about cases she'd handled. 3 different stories about kids suing their parents for control or emancipation. One case where a 16-year-old got removed from his home because his parents tried to force him into conversion therapy. Another where a 17-year-old girl sued for access to her college fund that her parents were withholding. Rachel won all of them. The articles called her a champion for children's rights and quoted her saying things about breaking cycles of abuse and protecting kids from toxic family situations. I kept reading and found an interview from 2 years ago where Rachel talked about her own family. She said she became a family lawyer because she watched her brother get destroyed by their father's control and nobody did anything to stop it. She said she spent her whole career making sure other kids didn't end up broken like her brother did. That's when it hit me that Rachel sees me as another case. Not her nephew, not family, but another kid who needs rescuing from bad parents. Her whole career is built on family conflict, on taking sides, on winning. She probably started planning this intervention the second I called her about the hair situation. The car, the photos, the blackmail, all of it was just her doing what she does in court, except this time, it was her own family. Mom's sister showed up the next day without warning. I was in my room when the doorbell rang. I heard Mom open the door, and then this weird silence followed by crying. I came downstairs and saw Mom hugging a woman who looked like an older version of her. Mom introduced her as Eliza, her sister, who she hadn't talked to in almost 10 years. Eliza came in and sat down at the kitchen table. She had this tired look on her face like she'd been driving all night. Mom made coffee, and they talked in low voices for a while before Mom called the rest of us in. Eliza said Mom reached out to her a few days ago after everything happened with Dad and Rachel. They'd had a falling out years back over their own father, Mom and Eliza's dad, who did similar controlling things to them when they were growing up. Eliza said their dad decided what schools they could attend, what majors they could study, what careers they could have. He told Mom she had to be an accountant because that was practical and stable. He told Eliza she had to be a teacher because that was respectable for a woman. Neither of them wanted those jobs, but their dad controlled the college money and wouldn't pay unless they did what he said. Mom went along with it. Eliza fought back and their dad cut her off completely. She put herself through school working 3 jobs and got a degree in engineering, which their dad said was inappropriate for a girl. They didn't speak for 15 years until he died. Mom sat there crying while Eliza talked. She said she thought marrying Dad meant she escaped her father's control. She picked someone ambitious and successful who seemed nothing like her dad. But Dad just turned out to be a different version of the same thing, controlling in different ways, and she didn't see it until now. Eliza said, "That's how these patterns work. You think you're breaking free, but you just find a new version of the same trap." I finally sat down with Dad alone that evening. Everyone else went out for groceries and left us in the house together. I told him I needed to say something, and he needed to just listen. I said, "I don't actually know if I want long hair forever. Maybe I'll cut it next month. Maybe I'll keep it for years. I haven't decided, but that's the point. It needs to be my choice. The hair isn't what this is really about. It's about him trying to control who I am because he's scared of something that happened to him 30 years ago." I said, "Until he lets go of that control, we can't have a real relationship. Everything between us will just be him trying to shape me into whatever makes him feel safe, and me either giving in or fighting back. That's not a father and son. That's just a power struggle." Dad looked at the floor for a long time. Then he said, "He doesn't know how to be a father without control. Grandpa never showed him another way. His whole understanding of parenting is about being strict, setting rules, making sure kids don't go down wrong paths. He said he's scared all the time that if he's not strict enough, his kids will end up weak or lost or broken. He knows that fear doesn't make sense. He knows being strict didn't protect him from getting broken. It's actually what broke him. But he doesn't know how to stop being afraid or how to parent without that fear driving everything he does." I asked him if he even likes who he became after Grandpa broke him. He said no. He said he hates the person he turned into, but he doesn't know how to be anyone else anymore. 3 days later, Rachel showed up at our house without calling first. Mom answered the door and immediately tried to close it. Rachel stuck her foot in the doorway and started talking loud about how she needed to see me, how she was trying to help, how Mom was being unreasonable. Mom told her to leave or she'd call the police. Rachel raised her voice and said, "I'm 18 and can make my own choices about who I see." Mom said that's exactly right. I can make my own choices, which means Rachel doesn't get to manipulate me into doing what she wants either. Rachel pushed back and said she was rescuing me from a toxic situation. Mom said I don't need rescuing. I need space to figure things out without adults using me to fight their own battles. Rachel called Mom an enabler who stayed with an abusive, controlling husband for 18 years. Mom called Rachel a lawyer who weaponizes family trauma for a living and can't tell the difference between helping someone and winning a case. They went back and forth like that for 5 minutes, both of them getting louder, until I came to the door and told Rachel to leave. She looked at me like I betrayed her. She said she bought me a car and exposed Dad's lies and protected me from his control. I said she did all of that to hurt Dad, not to help me, and I'm not going to be her weapon against him anymore. Rachel's face went red, and she started to say something else, but Mom stepped between us and told her one more time to leave. Rachel finally walked back to her rental car and drove away. I followed her out to the driveway. The rental car still had the engine ticking as it cooled down. Rachel leaned against the hood with her arms crossed, and I could see she was getting ready to argue before I even opened my mouth. "The car thing," I started. "I appreciate it, I really do, but I can't take it." Her face got tight. "Why not? It's already bought. It's sitting at the hotel. Because it's not really about helping me. It comes with all these expectations attached." "What expectations?" I said no strings. "You said that, yeah, but then you pulled out Dad's arrest photos and threatened his job and got his supervisor calling him at night. That's a lot of strings." Rachel pushed off the car and took a step closer. "I'm protecting you from your father's control. That's what this is about. No, you never asked me what I wanted. You just decided what was best and did it. That's the same thing Dad does, just with better intentions." She looked like I'd slapped her. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she found words. "I bought you a car. I exposed your father's hypocrisy. I'm giving you a way out. You did all that for you, not for me. You wanted to hurt Dad and I was just the excuse. That's not fair. Isn't it? When did you ask me if I wanted you to blow up my family? When did you check if I was okay with you threatening Dad's job?" Rachel's face went red. She looked away at the house, then back at me. "Your father is doing to you exactly what his father did to him. Someone needs to stop the cycle." "Maybe, but using me as a weapon isn't stopping anything. It's just making everything worse. I'm trying to help you. Then help me by asking what I need instead of deciding for me. That's what Dad does wrong. You're doing the same thing, just from the other direction." She stood there breathing hard, and I could see her working through something in her head. The lawyer face was cracking. "I've been waiting for this," she said quietly. "For years, watching him turn into our father, seeing him do the same controlling garbage, and I've been waiting for a chance to make him face it. So this was never about my hair or the car money. It was about both. But yes, when you called me about the situation, I saw my opportunity. I've wanted to expose his hypocrisy for so long, make him see what he became, and I was just the tool you needed. You're my nephew. I care about you, but you care more about proving Dad wrong, about winning against him." Rachel looked at the ground. "Watching your brother become exactly like the father who broke him, it makes you furious. Every holiday I visit, I see more of our dad in him. The control, the rigid rules, the fear of anything different. I wanted to shake him awake. By destroying his job, by threatening everything he built, by making him face consequences, by showing him he can't keep doing this. That's not your choice to make. It's between him and me." She wiped at her eyes fast, trying to hide it. "I thought I was helping." "I know, but you weren't." 2 days later, I was in my room when the house phone rang. Mom answered downstairs, and I heard her voice get sharp. Then she called up to me that it was Grandpa. I picked up the extension in my parents' room and held my hand over the mouthpiece. Dad was already on the line in his office. "You're an idiot," Grandpa was saying. His voice had that cold anger I remembered from family gatherings. That arrest should have stayed buried. "Hello to you too, Dad. Don't be smart with me. I heard about your work situation. Background investigation? Security clearance review? What were you thinking? I wasn't the one who brought it up. You should have been more careful. You should have made sure no one could find it." Dad's voice got quieter. "It happened 30 years ago. And you were stupid then too, running around campus with those protesters, getting yourself arrested. I told you what would happen. You told me a lot of things. I told you to cut that ridiculous hair and stop embarrassing the family. You refused. You forced my hand. You showed up at my dorm with clippers and tried to shave my head in front of my roommates. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. Dad had never told me that part. You needed to learn discipline, Grandpa said. You were out of control. I was 19 years old with long hair. That's not out of control. You were protesting military recruitment. You were associating with radicals. You got arrested because you tried to assault me on campus, Dad said. His voice was shaking now. The arrest happened because you grabbed me in front of the student center and I pushed you away. Campus police saw it, and when they found out about the protest, they arrested me to make an example. Silence on the line. I could hear Grandpa breathing. That's not how I remember it, Grandpa said finally. Of course it's not. You remember me as defiant and out of control. You remember needing to fix me. But what you did was abuse, and the arrest was a direct result of your abuse. I was trying to make you into a man. You were trying to break me, and you succeeded. Don't be dramatic. I lived in my car for 3 months because you cut me off. I nearly froze to death twice. I gave up everything I believed in, cut my hair, came crawling back and spent the next 30 years pretending none of it happened. You made your choices. I made survival choices because you gave me no other option. And now I'm doing the same thing to my own son, and I'm done pretending that's normal parenting. Grandpa's voice went ice cold. If that's how you feel, then you can consider yourself cut out of my will, and I'll make sure the rest of the family knows what kind of son you are. I don't care about your money. You will when you lose your job and have nothing. Your money and your approval have never been worth what they cost. I destroyed myself trying to earn both, and I'm not doing it anymore. You're making a mistake. No, the mistake was spending 30 years afraid of you. I'm done being afraid. Then you're on your own. Good. The line went dead. I stood there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone. Then I heard a sound from downstairs that I'd never heard before. Dad was crying. I went down slowly. Mom was already in Dad's office, holding him while he sobbed into her shoulder. His whole body was shaking. She looked up at me when I came to the doorway, and her eyes were wet too. They stayed like that for a long time. Dad crying and Mom holding him, and neither of them trying to hide it or pretend everything was fine. It was the most real I'd ever seen them together. The letter from Dad's company came a week later. Administrative leave pending investigation results. Not fired, but not allowed to work on anything classified until his security clearance situation got resolved. The HR person said it could take months. The first 2 weeks were paid. After that, nothing. Mom picked up extra shifts at her accounting job, working late 3 nights a week. My older brother started applying for weekend work. My sister offered to defer college for a semester. I watched bills pile up on the kitchen counter and listened to my parents talk quietly about money after they thought we were asleep. I started filling out applications at every restaurant and store in town, fast food places, grocery stores, the movie theater, anywhere that would hire someone with zero experience. After a dozen rejections, a local family restaurant called me back. They needed a dishwasher and someone to bus tables. Minimum wage, but they'd give me 30 hours a week. I took it. The work was hot and wet, and my hands got raw from the soap, but the paychecks were mine. I kept the $3,000 in my savings account and started looking at used cars I could actually afford, cheap ones with high mileage and dents in the doors, the kind that cost $1,500 and might last a year if you're lucky. It felt good to solve my own problem. No dad withholding money, no Rachel buying me things with hidden prices attached, just me working and saving and making my own choices. Mitchell showed up at our house 3 weeks after the phone call with Grandpa. Dad answered the door and stood there staring like he'd seen a ghost. Mitchell still had long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, and he wore jeans with holes in the knees. "Heard you're having a rough time," Mitchell said. "Thought I'd check in." Dad invited him inside. They talked for an hour in the living room while Mom made coffee. Then Mitchell invited all of us to dinner at his house that Saturday. His place was nothing like ours. Books everywhere, art on the walls, furniture that didn't match. His wife met us at the door with hugs, and his teenage kids came down the stairs with purple hair and nose piercings. The daughter had a tattoo sleeve and the son wore eyeliner. Mitchell introduced everyone and his face was just pure pride. "This is Sarah. She's studying graphic design. And this is James. He's in a band." We sat down to dinner, and it was chaos. Everyone talking over each other, laughing, arguing about music and politics, and whether the pasta was overcooked. Mitchell's wife told a story about their daughter getting suspended for organizing a protest at the school, and Mitchell was grinning the whole time. "She's got principles," he said. "Can't be mad about that." His daughter rolled her eyes, but she was smiling too. "Dad supported the protest. He called the principal and defended me." "Of course I did. You were standing up for what you believe in." I watched Dad watching them. His face was doing something complicated. Not quite jealous, not quite sad. More like he was seeing something he'd forgotten existed. After dinner, Mitchell's son showed us his band setup in the garage, drums and guitars and amps everywhere. He played us a song, and it was loud and messy, and his parents stood there beaming like he'd just performed at Carnegie Hall. On the drive home, nobody said anything for a long time. Then Dad spoke from the front seat. "I spent 20 years thinking I escaped Dad's influence by being successful, but I just became him with better excuses." Mom reached over and took his hand. My siblings and I sat in the back seat and watched our parents hold hands in silence. Outside the window, streetlights passed by one after another, and I thought about families that trust their kids to figure things out. Families where people can have purple hair and nose piercings and still be loved exactly as they are. Mom suggested we try family therapy the next morning over breakfast. Dad sat with his coffee and stared at his plate for a long time. Then he looked up and said he would go. He didn't argue or make excuses. He just said he didn't know how to fix what was broken between us, but he wanted to learn from someone who actually knew what they were doing. Mom made the call that afternoon and got us an appointment for the following week. The therapist's office smelled like lavender and had too many plants. Marguerite sat in a chair across from the couch where we all squeezed together. Dad kept crossing and uncrossing his legs. Mom held her purse in her lap like a shield. I picked at a loose thread on the couch cushion and tried not to look at anyone. Marguerite asked us to introduce ourselves and explain why we came. Dad struggled through 2 sentences about wanting to be a better father before he stopped talking completely. I said I was angry about everything and didn't know where to start. Mom cried a little when she talked about watching our family fall apart. Marguerite didn't try to fix anything right away. She just listened and took notes and said we'd work on this together over time. Our second session started with Mom talking about her own father. She told us he controlled her college choice and forced her into accounting when she wanted to study art. She met Dad and thought his drive to succeed meant freedom from control. But she realized she just traded one controlling man for another who made decisions without asking what she wanted. Dad sat there looking like someone had punched him. Marguerite asked Mom how long she'd felt this way. Mom said years, maybe since before I was born. Mom kept talking and admitted she'd been unhappy in her marriage for a long time. She stayed because she thought stable and miserable was better than the chaos of leaving. She thought keeping the family together mattered more than being happy. Hearing her say this out loud made Dad's face go pale. He said he genuinely didn't realize how disconnected they'd become. He thought they were fine because they didn't fight much and paid their bills on time. Mom laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. She said that's exactly the problem. Marguerite had them do an exercise where they each wrote down what they actually knew about the other person's current life. Not facts from years ago, but things happening right now. What they worried about. What made them happy. What they did when they were alone. Dad finished his list in under a minute. Mom took longer, but her list wasn't much longer. When they read them out loud, the lists were sad. Dad knew Mom worked in accounting and liked coffee. Mom knew Dad worked for a defense contractor and watched football on Sundays. They'd been living in the same house for 20 years and barely knew each other anymore. Just roommates managing kids and bills together. Rachel sent me an email 2 days later. The subject line said sorry, and the message was long. She apologized for overstepping and admitted she used me to hurt Dad. She said she'd been angry at him for 20 years for becoming exactly like their father. When I called about the hair situation, she saw her chance for revenge and took it. She said she'd respect whatever boundaries we set, but hoped we could eventually have a relationship that was about me and not about her issues with her brother. I read the email 3 times and didn't reply right away. I spent the next week looking at used cars online during my breaks at work. I found a Toyota with high mileage and a dent in the back bumper listed for $2,500. The seller lived across town and agreed to let me come see it. The car ran okay, and the interior smelled like cigarettes, but nothing looked broken. I took it to a mechanic who said it would probably last a few years if I kept up with oil changes. I bought it with money from my savings account. The title transfer took 2 days, and then the car was mine. Not as nice as the Honda Rachel offered, but completely mine with no strings attached. Dad saw my car in the driveway when he got home from work. He walked around it once and asked how much I paid. I told him. He asked if he could still contribute the $3,000 he promised. I said I'd accept it, but only if there were truly no conditions attached. He said there weren't any. He went inside and came back with his checkbook. He wrote the check and handed it to me without saying anything about my hair. Not one word. Just asked if I needed help with insurance or registration. I said I had it covered, but thanks. He nodded and went back inside. I spent 2 weeks thinking about my hair before I made the appointment. The salon I picked was one I'd never been to before because I didn't want to run into anyone I knew. The stylist asked what I wanted, and I told her shoulder length, not short, just trimmed and cleaned up. She worked for 30 minutes cutting away split ends and shaping it so it looked intentional instead of just long. When she finished, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself, not because I looked different, but because I'd actually chosen this. I paid cash and drove home with the windows down, feeling lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the hair on the floor. Dad was in the kitchen making coffee when I walked in. He looked up, and his whole body went still. I watched his jaw tighten and his eyes narrow like he was trying to decide if this counted as winning. His mouth opened and then closed again. He poured his coffee very slowly and took a sip. Then he said it looked good and walked past me to his office. That was it. No speech about masculinity or real men or finally seeing sense. Just those 3 words that felt more honest than anything he'd said to me in months. I stood in the kitchen alone and realized he'd actually looked at me instead of at his own reflection in my face. 3 weeks later, Dad came home early from work and called a family meeting. We all sat in the living room while he stood by the fireplace looking older than I'd ever seen him. The investigation finished that morning and he still had his job. His supervisor told him he was moved to a different department that didn't require security clearance. The pay was 30% less, but they weren't firing him. Mom asked if he could reapply for clearance later, and Dad said maybe in 5 years if he kept his record clean. My sister asked what that meant for our college funds, and Dad said we'd figure it out. He didn't make excuses or blame anyone. He just gave us the facts and then sat down next to Mom on the couch. She took his hand, and they sat there together while we all processed what this meant for our family. The HR representative called Dad 2 days after that to schedule a final meeting. Her name was Lily Grace, and she'd been the one handling his case from the beginning. Dad asked if I wanted to come with him, and I said yes, because I wanted to understand what had actually happened. We drove to his office in silence and went up to the third-floor conference room. Lily was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun. She shook both our hands and gestured for us to sit. She told Dad that his honesty once the investigation started was the only reason he still had a job. The false applications could have gotten him fired and possibly prosecuted, but he cooperated completely, provided documentation, and showed genuine understanding of why it mattered. She said the company valued that kind of integrity even when it came late. Dad thanked her, and we left. In the parking lot, he sat in the driver's seat for 5 minutes before starting the car. I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence is the only appropriate response. The letter from Grandpa arrived on a Saturday morning in a thick cream envelope with his law firm's return address. Dad opened it at the kitchen table while Mom and I watched. He read it once, folded it carefully, and put it back in the envelope. Then he filed it in the cabinet where we kept insurance papers and tax returns. Mom asked what it said, and Dad told us Grandpa was removing him from the will and cutting off all contact. My younger brother asked if that meant we'd never see Grandpa again, and Dad said probably not. Then he said something that surprised all of us. He said losing Grandpa's approval actually felt like relief, because he'd spent 40 years chasing something that was never worth having in the first place. He'd built his whole life trying to become someone Grandpa would respect, and all it did was turn him into someone he didn't recognize. Mom started crying, and Dad held her while she said she was sorry for all of it. Rachel showed up for Thanksgiving without the usual tension that followed her everywhere. She brought wine and flowers and asked Mom if she needed help in the kitchen. During dinner, she asked me about my job at the restaurant, and actually listened to my answers instead of planning her next comment. She asked about my college plans without pushing or suggesting or trying to shape my response. When I said I wasn't sure yet, she just nodded and said that made sense. After dinner, she and Dad did dishes together, and I heard them talking quietly, but couldn't make out the words. The whole visit felt different, like she'd finally stopped treating our family as a problem to solve and started seeing us as actual people. The next morning, Rachel asked Dad if they could talk privately. They went out to the back porch and sat in the chairs Mom had bought last spring. I watched through the kitchen window while I made breakfast. They talked for over an hour. At one point, Rachel was crying, and Dad put his hand on her shoulder. Then Dad was crying, and Rachel handed him tissues from her purse. When they came back inside, they both looked exhausted, but somehow lighter. Rachel found me in the living room and hugged me hard. She said she was sorry for using me to hurt Dad, and that she'd been carrying anger for 20 years that had nothing to do with me. Dad said he was sorry for becoming exactly what he'd promised himself he'd never be. They didn't fix everything with that conversation, but they started something that felt real. I made my decision about college in early December. I told my parents I wanted to take a gap year to work and save money and figure out what I actually wanted to study. Dad's face did that thing where I could see him fighting his instincts. His hands gripped his coffee mug tighter, and his shoulders tensed up. But then he took a breath and said, "Okay." He asked if I had a plan, and I told him I'd keep working at the restaurant and take some online classes to explore different subjects. He said that sounded reasonable and asked if I needed help researching programs. I said I'd let him know. Mom smiled at both of us like she was watching something important happen. Later that night, Dad knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could talk. He said taking time to figure things out was probably smarter than rushing into a major I'd hate. Then he admitted his instinct was to push me toward engineering school immediately, because that's what he wished someone had let him do. But he was trying to recognize when his fears were talking, instead of his actual thoughts about what was best for me. Mom started going to the community center on Saturday mornings in January. She signed up for a watercolor painting class that met for 3 hours every week. Dad had to handle grocery shopping and laundry on Saturdays now, but he never complained about it. Mom came home with paint under her fingernails and stories about the other students. She wasn't quitting her accounting job or planning to become a professional artist. She was just doing something that made her happy without needing permission or justification. One Saturday, she brought home a painting of our backyard in autumn and hung it in the dining room. Dad stood looking at it for a long time and then told her it was beautiful. She kissed his cheek and said thank you. Our therapy session in February was different from the others. Marguerite asked Dad to talk about the winter he lived in his car, and Dad actually did it without deflecting. He described sleeping in the back seat with every piece of clothing he owned piled on top of him. He talked about waking up so cold he couldn't feel his fingers and having to run the engine just to thaw out enough to drive to campus. He said Grandpa showed up one morning after a particularly bad night, and Dad thought maybe he'd come to help. Instead, Grandpa stood next to the car and told him he looked pathetic and weak. He said Dad could end this any time by admitting he was wrong and accepting that his father knew what was best. Dad said he almost died that night because the temperature dropped to 15 degrees and his car battery died. He gave in the next morning because he genuinely believed he would freeze to death if he didn't. Grandpa drove him to a barber and watched while they shaved his head completely bald. Then Grandpa took him to buy new clothes and told him this was what growing up looked like. Dad said he'd carried shame about that choice for 30 years because he felt like he'd betrayed everything he believed in just to survive. Marguerite leaned forward in her chair during our next therapy session and looked at Dad with this gentle but firm expression. She asked him to think about that winter night in the car when he thought he might freeze to death. Dad shifted uncomfortably and said he'd rather not go back there. She nodded but pressed anyway, asking him what choice he really had in that moment. Dad said he could have kept refusing and maybe died for his principles. Marguerite shook her head and said no, that wasn't a choice between principles and survival. It was just survival, and choosing to live when you're 19 and terrified and alone isn't weakness. She said he'd been carrying shame for 30 years because he thought giving in made him a coward, but actually it just made him human. Dad's eyes got watery, and he said it felt like betraying everything he believed in. Marguerite asked if he would judge his own son for choosing to live in that situation. Dad said of course not. She asked why he held himself to an impossible standard that he wouldn't hold anyone else to. Dad didn't have an answer for that. Mom reached over and took his hand. The next week, Marguerite gave Dad homework to write a letter to his younger self, the kid with long hair who believed in things. Dad looked skeptical but said he'd try. When we came back for our family session, Dad brought a notebook with him. His hands shook when he opened it. Marguerite asked if he wanted to read some of it, and Dad said he'd try, but he might not get through it. He started reading in this quiet voice about how sorry he was for abandoning the person he used to be. He apologized for being ashamed of that kid, for trying to erase him completely, for spending decades pretending he never existed. Dad's voice cracked when he read the part about how he should have been proud of the kid who stood up to Grandpa for months, instead of disgusted with the kid who finally broke. He said he was sorry for treating his own son the way Grandpa treated him, for letting fear turn him into the thing he hated most. Dad couldn't finish reading because he was crying too hard. Mom pulled him close, and my siblings and I just sat there watching our father fall apart in a way that somehow felt like healing instead of breaking. Sitting in that therapy office watching Dad cry, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry at him anymore. The anger had been there so long I'd gotten used to it, but now it was just gone, replaced by this sad understanding. I was still hurt by what he'd done with the hair ultimatum and the money. That pain hadn't disappeared, but I could see now that Dad had been drowning in his own stuff for decades, and he'd grabbed onto control because it was the only thing that made him feel safe. He wasn't some villain trying to ruin my life. He was just a scared person doing what scared people do when they don't know how to process their trauma. I didn't need to forgive him completely or pretend everything was fine. I just needed to see him as a whole person instead of just the dad who tried to control me. Mom caught my eye and smiled a little, like she could tell something had shifted in me. 2 weeks later, my siblings and I had our own therapy session without our parents. Marguerite wanted us to talk about how we'd all been affected by the family patterns. My older brother sat forward and admitted something I'd never heard before. He said he'd been really strict with his own kids, making tons of rules and getting mad when they broke them, because that's what he learned from Dad. He said his daughter asked him last month why he was always so angry, and it hit him that he was doing the same cycle. My sister talked about how she'd never felt like she could make her own choices growing up, and now she had trouble making decisions about anything because she always worried someone would tell her she was wrong. My younger brother said he'd learned to just agree with whatever Dad said and keep his real thoughts to himself, which made him feel fake all the time. We all realized we'd been carrying different pieces of Dad's trauma without even knowing it. My older brother said he wanted to break the cycle with his kids before it was too late. 6 months after my 18th birthday dinner, our family looked completely different. We had therapy every Thursday evening, and we actually talked about real feelings instead of just surface stuff. Dad asked questions now instead of giving orders. When I mentioned wanting to try something new, he'd ask what interested me about it instead of telling me why it was a bad idea. It was still awkward sometimes because we were all learning how to do this. Dad would catch himself starting to lecture and stop mid-sentence to rephrase as a question. Mom would remind us when someone was falling back into old patterns, but it felt real in a way our family never had before. We weren't pretending everything was perfect or acting like none of the bad stuff happened. We were just trying to be honest with each other, and that made all the difference. Mom and Dad went on their first real date in years one Saturday in March. They got dressed up, and went to this Italian restaurant downtown that they used to go to before kids. When they came home that night, they were both laughing about something that happened with their waiter, who apparently kept forgetting their order and bringing random food to their table. Dad was doing this impression of the waiter's confused face, and Mom was laughing, so hard she had tears in her eyes. Seeing them actually enjoy each other's company instead of just existing in the same house gave me this weird feeling of hope. They'd been married for 23 years, but I'd never really seen them look happy together. They looked at each other like they remembered why they got married in the first place. Mom kissed Dad's cheek, and he smiled at her in this genuine way I hadn't seen before. I started working full-time at the restaurant in April, doing prep work in the mornings and serving tables at night. The money was decent, and I was saving everything I could for college. I also signed up for online classes through the community college to explore different subjects. I took a psychology class, a creative writing class, and an intro to business class, just to see what interested me. Dad asked about my classes almost every day, with real curiosity instead of judgment. We'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner and talk about what I was learning. When I told him about a theory from my psychology class, he'd ask follow-up questions and share his own thoughts. We had actual conversations about ideas instead of arguments about expectations. It felt strange at first because I kept waiting for him to tell me I was wrong or push me toward something practical, but he just listened and engaged with what I was actually saying. Rachel started calling me every couple weeks, and we built a relationship based on who we actually were instead of the family drama. She told me about cases she was working on, weird clients she dealt with, funny things that happened in court. I told her about my job at the restaurant, the classes I was taking, what I was thinking about for my future. We connected as real people instead of as pieces in some game against Dad. She was still intense and opinionated, but she respected my boundaries now. When she started giving unsolicited advice, I'd tell her I just wanted to talk, not get coached, and she'd back off. She admitted that seeing our family actually work through things made her realize her approach had been wrong. She said she'd been so focused on punishing Dad that she didn't think about what I actually needed. Dad got promoted to a senior position in his non-classified division in May. The pay increase didn't fully make up for what he'd lost with the security clearance, but it showed his company valued his work beyond the clearance. He came home that day and told us about the promotion with this proud expression I'd never seen on his face before. He'd spent months feeling like a failure because of the clearance situation, and this promotion proved he still had worth. Mom hugged him and said she was proud of him. My siblings and I congratulated him. He said it felt good to be recognized for what he could actually do instead of just what paperwork he could access. That night at dinner, he seemed lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. Grandpa sent a brief email in late May asking how everyone was doing. It was just 3 sentences with no real emotion or acknowledgement of anything that happened. But for Grandpa, asking how people were doing was basically as close to an apology as he was capable of giving. Dad showed me the email and asked what I thought he should do. I said it was up to him, but he didn't owe Grandpa anything. Dad wrote back a polite response saying we were all doing well and left it at that. He didn't try to rebuild the relationship or invite Grandpa to visit. He recognized that some boundaries needed to stay firm for his own health. Mom said she was proud of him for not caving to the guilt or the old patterns. Dad said it felt strange to not chase Grandpa's approval, but also freeing in a way he didn't expect. My 19th birthday came around in early June, and nobody made a big deal about it. Mom asked if I wanted to invite friends over or go out somewhere special, but I told her a quiet family dinner sounded good. We ordered pizza and sat around the kitchen table, just the 6 of us, and it felt different from last year in ways I couldn't quite name. Dad gave me a card with a check for $500 inside and a handwritten note that took up the whole inside of the card. The note said he was proud of who I was becoming, not who he'd tried to force me to be, and that watching me figure out my own path had taught him more about being a father than anything else ever had. My throat got tight reading it, and I had to look away for a second before I could say thank you. My siblings gave me gift cards and a book about traveling that my sister said made her think of me, and Mom made chocolate cake from scratch, even though she hates baking. We ate too much and laughed about stupid things, and nobody fought or walked away angry. I looked around the table at my family, all of us with our damage and our progress and our constant work to be better than we were, and something settled in my chest that had been restless for as long as I could remember. Breaking the cycle didn't mean we were fixed or perfect or done healing. It meant choosing honesty when lying felt safer, choosing connection when approval seemed easier, choosing to grow even when staying the same felt more comfortable. We were all still figuring it out, making mistakes and trying again, but we were doing it together now instead of alone in our separate corners. That made all the difference.